It began on a night much like any other, but with an unsettling chill in the air that seemed to seep into the bones. The gravedigger, a man of solitude and habit, had long grown accustomed to the eerie quiet of the cemetery after dark. The world outside could be alive with the bustle of life, but within these iron gates it was as if time stood still, the silence heavy with the weight of the dead. He relished that silence once, finding peace in the rhythm of his work, but recently something had shifted. It was a small thing at first, a fleeting sensation, like the feeling of being watched, that prickled the back of his neck as he went about his nightly rounds. He dismissed it as paranoia, a trick of the mind that comes from too much time spent among the graves. But as the days turned into weeks, that sensation grew, gnawing at him, refusing to be ignored. The cemetery, which once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The trees that lined the paths whispered with voices he couldn't quite make out, and the shadows cast by the moonlight seemed to stretch just a little too far, lingering at the edges of his vision. The graves, orderly and quiet by day, took on a sinister quality at night. He found himself hurrying through his tasks, eager to finish before the darkness fully enveloped the land. It was as if the dead were stirring, restless beneath the earth, their unease bleeding into his own. One night as he locked the gates, he thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, a figure pale and ghostly, slipping between the tombstones. He turned quickly, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, only the cold wind rustling through the trees. He laughed it off, a dry, nervous sound that echoed in the empty night. But the unease remained. The figure stayed with him, an afterimage burned into his mind, making him jump at every shadow, every creak of the earth beneath his feet. The real terror began when he started noticing changes in the cemetery. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A gravestone that seemed slightly out of place, a patch of earth that looked freshly disturbed when it shouldn't have been. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he was imagining things, or maybe some animal had been digging in the night. But the anomalies grew more frequent, more disturbing. He would find flowers, long wilted, suddenly fresh and blooming atop graves that had been neglected for years. Or a gravestone with a name he didn't recognize, though he had been tending these grounds for decades and knew every soul buried there. The most unsettling discovery came when he found a grave that was not only disturbed, but completely uncovered. The earth, which had been packed tightly just the day before, was now loose, as if someone, or something, had clawed its way out. His hands trembled as he filled the grave back in, dirt slipping through his fingers, cold and damp. He told himself it was a prank, that someone was playing tricks on him, trying to scare the old gravedigger. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no one else there. The cemetery was empty, save for him and the dead. Each night after that, the sense of dread grew stronger. The air felt thick with it, a tangible force pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. His sleep was plagued with nightmares, visions of corpses rising from their graves, their skeletal hands reaching out for him, their eyes hollow and accusing. He would wake in a cold sweat, the sound of their whispers still echoing in his ears. Their words unintelligible, but filled with a venomous intent. And always, there was that figure, lurking at the edge of his dreams, faceless but terrifying in its presence. The gravedigger began to dread the nights, the thought of returning to the cemetery filling him with a fear he couldn't shake. He took to carrying a lantern with him, though it did little to dispel the darkness that seemed to close in around him with each passing night. The light flickered weakly, casting long trembling shadows that seemed to dance mockingly at the edge of his vision. He started talking to himself, a low murmur meant to drown out the whispers, to reassure himself that he was still in control, that he hadn't lost his mind. But the cemetery had become a place of terror, a living nightmare that he could not escape. The once familiar paths now twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, leading him deeper into the heart of the graveyard, where the shadows were darkest and the silence was thick with menace. He could feel the eyes of the dead on him, watching, waiting for something he couldn't comprehend. Each step felt like a descent into madness, a journey into the unknown where the rules of the living no longer applied. As the gravedigger stood among the graves, the lantern's weak light barely cutting through the darkness, he realized with a chilling certainty that he was no longer alone. Something was out there. Something ancient and malevolent, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. The unease that had been gnawing at him for weeks finally crystallized into pure, unadulterated fear. The dead were restless, and they were calling to him. The first sign that something was truly wrong came in the form of small, almost insignificant disturbances that gnawed at the edges of the gravedigger's already fraying sanity. It started with the objects in the caretaker's shack. A shovel he distinctly remembered leaning against the wall now lay flat on the ground, its handle pointing ominously toward the door. A stack of papers, meticulously organized, had been scattered across the floor, as if by a sudden gust of wind, but the windows were tightly shut. At first, he dismissed these as the result of his own carelessness, the inevitable consequence of his growing exhaustion. But as the days wore on, these occurrences became more frequent, more unsettling. Then came the whispers. At first, they were just faint murmurs carried by the wind, so soft that he could almost convince himself they were imagined. But soon, they grew louder, more insistent, a constant background noise that seemed to follow him wherever he went. It wasn't just the sound of the wind in the trees or the creaking of the old cemetery gate. These whispers were different, filled with an urgent, pleading tone that sent chills racing down his spine. The voices seemed to come from all directions, swirling around him like a malevolent storm. They were always just on the edge of understanding, words half-formed and dripping with malice, their meanings elusive but filled with an unmistakable threat. The dreams that haunted his nights grew darker, more vivid. He saw the cemetery in these dreams, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light that seemed to drain the color from everything. The gravestones, normally so still and silent, shifted and moved like living things, rearranging themselves into patterns he couldn't comprehend. In one dream, he saw the graves opening, one by one, as the dead clawed their way out of the earth, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow voids that stared directly into his soul. He would wake from these nightmares with his heart pounding, his body drenched in sweat, the taste of dirt on his tongue as if he had been buried alive. But it was during his waking hours that the true terror began to take hold. The gravestones, which had been the first signs of something amiss, continued to move. Each morning, as he made his rounds, he found them in different positions, turned slightly or shifted entirely. At first, the changes were subtle. A stone that had always faced east now faced west. A name that had been clearly etched in stone now appeared faint and worn, as if aged by centuries overnight. But soon, the shifts became more pronounced. Entire rows of graves would be out of place, the names and dates on the stones scrambled into nonsensical gibberish. The cemetery had become a puzzle that defied logic, a labyrinth of shifting stones that seemed to mock his attempts to bring order to the chaos. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. A gravestone that had once borne the name of a woman who died in 1892 now bore his own name, along with the date of his birth. The date of death was blank, but the space was there, waiting. He stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest, unable to tear his eyes away from the stone. Was this some cruel joke? But who could have done it? He was the only one who had access to the cemetery. After dark, the only one who walked these paths. The implications were too terrible to consider, and he forced himself to look away. But the image of his own name carved into the cold stone burned itself into his mind. A brand of impending doom. The voices, now louder than ever, seemed to taunt him, laughing at his fear, whispering secrets that he couldn't quite grasp. They followed him everywhere, a chorus of the damned that grew more persistent with each passing night. He tried to escape them, sought refuge in his small, cluttered house at the edge of the cemetery. But even there, the whispers found him. They seeped through the walls, filled his dreams, and echoed in his mind until he could barely think straight. Sleep offered no respite. Each time he closed his eyes, he was transported back to the cemetery, the grave shifting and moving like a living organism. The dead watching him with hollow, accusing eyes. One night, driven to the edge of madness by the relentless whispers and the shifting gravestones, he decided to confront whatever force was haunting the cemetery. Armed with only a flashlight and a trembling resolve, he ventured out into the darkness, the beam of light cutting through the thick fog that had settled over the graves. As he walked, the fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around him like a shroud, muffling the sounds of the night. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of a tree branch or the distant cry of an owl. But the whispers continued, rising in volume, urging him deeper into the heart of the graveyard. He found himself standing before a grave that hadn't been there before. A new grave, freshly dug, with no marker to indicate who was buried there. The earth was still loose, the grass not yet regrown. His breath caught in his throat as he stared down at the dark, yawning hole, a sense of dread washing over him. Something was terribly wrong. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices that swirled around him, filling his mind with terror. He knew he should turn back, leave this cursed place and never return, but his feet refused to move. It was as if the grave was calling to him, drawing him in with a force he couldn't resist. With trembling hands, he aimed the flashlight at the open grave, the beam illuminating the dark, moist earth below. At first, he saw nothing, just dirt and stones, the remnants of what had once been a resting place for the dead. But as he looked closer, his heart nearly stopped. Something was moving down there. Something small and pale, writhing just beneath the surface. His breath caught in his throat as the shape began to take form, a hand, skeletal and decomposed, reaching up from the earth as if trying to claw its way back to the surface. He stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. The darkness closed in around him, the whispers now a deafening roar in his ears. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for the flashlight, his hands shaking uncontrollably. When he finally managed to grab it, he pointed it back at the grave, his heart pounding in his chest. But the hand was gone. The earth was still once more, the grave undisturbed as if nothing had ever happened. But the damage was done. The cemetery was no longer just a place of the dead, it was a place of madness, where reality twisted and turned, and nothing could be trusted. The gravedigger knew then that he was no longer in control, that whatever force was at work here was far beyond his understanding. The voices, the moving gravestones, the shifting earth, it was all part of a puzzle he couldn't hope to solve, a nightmare from which there was no waking. The terror had taken root in his mind, and there was no escaping it. The mystery of the cemetery had consumed him, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would only get worse from here. The gravedigger's descent into madness was slow, insidious, like a poison seeping into his veins. The once sturdy walls of his sanity began to crumble, piece by piece, as the cemetery's horrors tightened their grip on his mind. He found himself withdrawing from the world, avoiding the living as if they too carried the cemetery's curse. The small town nearby, where he once visited for groceries and the occasional drink at the pub, now felt alien to him. The bustling streets, the cheerful chatter of neighbors, none of it made sense anymore. It was as if he existed in a different reality, one where the line between the living and the dead had been irrevocably blurred. His home, a modest shack on the edge of the cemetery, became his prison. The curtains remained drawn, the doors locked tight, as if shutting out the world could somehow keep the terror at bay. But the isolation only served to amplify his fears. The whispers followed him inside, creeping into every corner of his mind, their voices a constant reminder of the horrors lurking just outside his door. He stopped answering the phone, let the mail pile up unopened, cut off from the few friends and family he had left. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't. The cemetery had taken something from him, something essential, and in its place it had left a gaping void, filled with fear and uncertainty. Nights were the worst. Sleep, once a refuge, had become another battlefield, a place where his deepest fears manifested in the most horrifying ways. The dreams were relentless, each one more disturbing than the last. He saw the cemetery in his mind's eye, not as it was, but twisted and corrupted, a nightmarish landscape where the graves seemed to stretch on forever, their markers etched with the names of people he'd never heard of, yet somehow knew. The dead were always there, lurking at the edges of his dreams, their faces twisted with rage and despair, their eyes hollow pits of darkness that seemed to draw him in, drowning him in their sorrow. But it wasn't just the dreams. The cemetery's influence seeped into his waking hours, blurring the boundaries between reality and nightmare. He began to see things, fleeting glimpses of figures in the corner of his vision, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, faces in the windows that vanished when he turned to look. At first, he told himself they were just tricks of the light, products of an overactive imagination. But deep down, he knew better. The cemetery was alive, its malevolent energy reaching out to him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. Every day, it became harder to distinguish what was real from what was imagined, until even the simplest tasks became fraught with terror. One evening, as he sat in his dimly lit living room, nursing a glass of whiskey in a futile attempt to calm his nerves, he heard a noise that made his blood run cold. It was a soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood, coming from just outside the door. He froze, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound continued, slow and deliberate, as if something was trying to claw its way inside. He knew he should get up, see what it was, but his body refused to move, paralyzed by fear. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, and he could feel the walls closing in on him, the room growing smaller and darker with each passing second. When the sound finally stopped, the silence that followed was worse. It pressed down on him, thick and suffocating, filled with the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. He forced himself to stand, his legs shaking beneath him, and made his way to the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob, the cold metal slick with sweat. Slowly he turned it, the door creaking open on rusty hinges, and peered outside. The night was still, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. There was no sign of anything, or anyone. Just the vast expanse of the cemetery, its gravestones bathed in the pale light of the moon, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. He stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold night air, and saw something that made his heart skip a beat. On the ground, just outside the door, was a trail of dirt leading away from the house, back toward the cemetery. The dirt was fresh, as if someone, or something, had been dragging it along with them. His eyes followed the trail, dread pooling in his stomach as it led him to the nearest grave. It was the same grave that had haunted his dreams, the one that appeared and disappeared at will, its marker a blank stone that held no name, no date, just a cold, lifeless slab of rock. He knew he shouldn't follow it, knew that whatever lay at the end of that trail could only bring more horror, but something compelled him forward. The whispers were back, louder than ever, urging him on, filling his mind with half-formed thoughts and fragments of memories that weren't his own. He stumbled toward the grave, his heart hammering in his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The cemetery seemed to shift around him, the gravestones closing in, the trees swaying with an unnatural rhythm that matched the pounding in his head. When he reached the grave, he fell to his knees, the cold earth biting into his skin through his clothes. The trail of dirt ended here, at this nameless, faceless grave. And as he stared at it, the ground beneath him began to tremble. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices that filled his mind, drowning out all rational thought. He could feel something moving beneath the earth, something ancient and terrible, something that had been waiting for this moment. The ground cracked open, and a A skeletal, decayed hand reached out, grasping at the air, as if trying to pull itself free from the grave. Terror surged through him, and he scrambled back, his mind screaming at him to run, to get away from this place. But his body wouldn't respond. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear and horror as the hand continued to claw its way out of the earth. He watched, helpless, as more of the figure emerged, a grotesque parody of life, its bones covered in rotting flesh, its empty eye sockets staring directly at him. The whispers became a roar, filling his ears, his mind, every corner of his consciousness, until he thought he would go mad from the sound. But just as suddenly as it began, the figure stopped moving. The whispers ceased, leaving only the deafening silence of the night. The hand, now fully exposed, lay still, half buried in the dirt, as if waiting for something. He stared at it, his breath coming in ragged gasps, unable to tear his eyes away. The cemetery was silent once more, the only sound the pounding of his own heart in his ears. And then, as if waking from a nightmare, the gravedigger realized he was alone. The hand, the figure, the whispers, it was all gone, vanished as if it had never been. But the terror remained, a cold, gnawing fear that had taken root deep within him. He knew now that there was no escaping the cemetery, no escaping the darkness that had claimed his mind. The dead had awakened, and they were coming for him. He stumbled back to his shack, locking the door behind him, but he knew it was futile. The cemetery had claimed him, body and soul, and there was no escape. The darkness had seeped into his very being, and no matter where he went, no matter what he did, it would follow him, haunt him, until it finally consumed him. The gravedigger was lost, trapped in a nightmare of his own making, where the dead walked and the living were but shadows, fleeting and insubstantial. As he sat in the darkness of his shack, the whispers returned, soft and insistent, filling his mind with thoughts not his own. He knew with a chilling certainty that he was no longer in control, that the cemetery had become a part of him, and he a part of it. The dead were waiting, and soon they would come for him, dragging him down into the cold earth, where he would join them in eternal, restless slumber. The gravedigger's descent into the depths of terror was no longer just a gradual decline. It had become a freefall into madness, his days blurred into nights, and his nights into an endless nightmare from which there was no waking. The cemetery, once a place of quiet reflection, had transformed into a landscape of pure horror, where the rules of reality twisted and distorted with each passing moment. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere of the place had become tainted by the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Every breath he took was filled with the scent of decay, a constant reminder that the cemetery was not just a resting place for the dead, but a living entity with its own malevolent will. The first true sign of his impending collapse came when he began to lose all sense of time. Hours, days, even weeks slipped through his fingers like sand, leaving him disoriented and confused. He could no longer remember the last time he had slept through the night or seen the sun rise without a sense of impending dread. His mind, once sharp and focused, had become a labyrinth of fear and paranoia, where every shadow held a hidden threat and every sound was the prelude to some unspeakable horror. One night, as the fog rolled in thick and heavy, blanketing the cemetery in a shroud of white, he found himself wandering among the graves, unable to recall how he had gotten there. The fog clung to him, cold and clammy, seeping into his bones as he stumbled through the darkness. The gravestones loomed out of the mist like sentinels, their inscriptions warped and unreadable, as if the very stone had been corrupted by the cemetery's dark influence. He tried to find his way back to the shack, but the paths twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the heart of the graveyard. As he wandered, lost in the fog, he began to hear the voices again. They were louder now, more insistent, their whispers filled with anger and despair. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, yet the meaning was clear. He was not welcome here. The dead were restless, their spirits disturbed by his presence, and they wanted him gone. The whispers grew in intensity, echoing in his mind, until he was no longer sure if they were coming from outside or from within his own head. And then the hallucinations began. At first, they were just fleeting glimpses, figures in the fog, half seen out of the corner of his eye, that vanished the moment he turned to look. But as the night wore on, they became more vivid, more real. He saw the dead rising from their graves, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes hollow voids that stared into his soul. They reached out for him with skeletal hands, their fingers like claws, grasping at the air as if trying to drag him down into the earth with them. He ran, stumbling over graves, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to escape the horrors that pursued him. The fog closed in around him, thick and impenetrable, and he could hear the voices all around him, laughing, taunting him, driving him deeper into madness. His heart pounded in his chest, a wild, frantic beat that matched the rhythm of his panicked thoughts. There was no escape, no way out of the nightmare that had become his reality. Just when he thought he could run no more, he found himself standing before a mausoleum he had never seen before. It was old, its stone walls cracked and weathered, covered in a thick layer of moss and ivy. The door was ajar, a black maw that seemed to swallow the light, leading into a darkness so complete it felt alive. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever lay beyond that door was the source of the terror that had consumed his life. But the voices would not let him turn away. They urged him forward, filling his mind with a compulsion he couldn't resist. He stepped inside, the darkness closing around him like a suffocating blanket. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting flesh. And the silence was so profound. It pressed in on him from all sides. He could feel the weight of the stone above him, the cold seep of the walls, and the oppressive presence of something ancient and evil lurking just beyond the edge of his perception. As he moved deeper into the mausoleum, the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own, drawing him forward with an irresistible force. He stumbled down a flight of stairs, each step taking him further into the bowels of the earth. The air grew colder, more oppressive, until each breath felt like it was being drawn through a veil of ice. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more urgent, until they were a deafening roar in his ears. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a large, circular chamber, its walls lined with crumbling statues and faded murals that depicted scenes of death and despair. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, and on it lay a book, its pages yellowed with age, its cover adorned with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light of his lantern. He approached the altar with trepidation, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But something compelled him to move forward, to reach out and touch the book. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, the room was filled with a blinding light, and the whispers fell silent. For a brief moment, he felt a sense of peace, as if the darkness had lifted and the weight of the cemetery had been lifted from his shoulders. But the feeling was fleeting, replaced almost instantly by a crushing wave of terror. The light dimmed, revealing the true horror of the chamber. The walls, once adorned with murals, were now covered in the faces of the dead, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths frozen in silent screams. The statues had come to life, their stone forms twisted into grotesque parodies of humanity, their eyes following his every move. And then, the book began to speak. Its voice was deep and resonant, filled with an ancient malice that made his blood run cold. It spoke in the same language as the whispers, its words a dark incantation that seemed to echo through the very stone of the mausoleum. As the book chanted, the chamber began to tremble, the walls closing in, the floor shifting beneath his feet. The air grew thick with the scent of death, and he could feel the presence of something vast and terrible rising from the depths of the earth. He tried to run, but his legs refused to move, as if rooted to the spot by some unseen force. The book's chant grew louder, more insistent, until it filled his mind, drowning out all thought. The faces on the walls began to move, their mouths opening in silent screams, their eyes filling with blood. The statues reached out for him with stone hands, their fingers closing around his arms, pulling him toward the altar. In that moment, he realized the truth. The cemetery, the voices, the shifting gravestones. It was all a trap, a lure to draw him to this place, to this moment. The book was the source of the terror, the heart of the darkness that had consumed him. And now it was calling him, demanding a sacrifice, a soul to feed its insatiable hunger. As the statues dragged him toward the altar, the book's voice filled his mind. A dark, insidious presence that promised power, knowledge, and freedom from the terror that had plagued him. But he knew it was a lie. The book was a vessel of evil, and its promises were nothing more than a bait to ensnare him further. He struggled against the statue's grip, but it was no use. The darkness had claimed him, and there was no escape. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the book's cover, its symbols glowing with a malevolent light, and the faces of the dead, their eyes filled with an unending hunger, staring at him with a malevolent glee. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that filled his mind with madness. The chamber shook with the force of the book's incantation, and the last thing he heard was the sound of the mausoleum collapsing in on itself, burying him in the darkness forever. And then there was silence. The cemetery returned to its previous stillness, the fog dissipating, the gravestones standing silent and unmoving once more. But the darkness remained, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for its next victim. The gravedigger was gone, consumed by the terror he had unleashed, his soul lost to the darkness of the cemetery, where the dead walked and the living were but fleeting shadows in the night. The terror that had consumed the gravedigger reached a fever pitch as he realized that the cemetery was not just a place of the dead, but a puzzle, a malevolent enigma designed to drive him to the brink of insanity. Every night, the cemetery whispered its secrets to him, but these secrets were fragmented, disjointed, like the pieces of a nightmarish jigsaw puzzle. The whispers seemed to carry messages from the beyond, words that hinted at a dark ancient secret buried deep within the cemetery, a truth so terrible that it defied comprehension. But the more he tried to understand, the more the mystery slipped through his fingers, leaving him grasping at shadows. His mind became a labyrinth of doubt and fear, each thought leading him deeper into the darkness. He spent hours, days, even weeks trying to piece together the clues, examining gravestones for hidden messages, poring over old records in the hope of finding some connection, some explanation for the horrors that plagued him. But the cemetery seemed to mock his efforts, shifting and changing with each new discovery, erasing what little progress he had made. Gravestones that had held vital clues would disappear overnight, replaced by blank slabs of stone, as if the cemetery itself was conspiring against him, determined to keep its secrets hidden. The whispers became his constant companions, filling his mind with cryptic riddles and half-formed thoughts. They spoke of a terrible curse, of souls trapped in the cemetery for eternity, unable to find peace. They whispered of a powerful force buried deep beneath the earth, a force that had been awakened by his presence and now sought to claim him as its own. But the whispers were maddeningly vague, their words twisted and distorted, leaving him more confused and terrified than ever. He began to doubt his own sanity, wondering if the whispers were even real, or if they were just the product of his unraveling mind. His isolation deepened as the mystery consumed him. He cut off all contact with the outside world, convinced that no one would believe his story, that they would think he had gone mad. And perhaps he had. The line between reality and nightmare had long since blurred, and he no longer knew what was real and what was imagined. The cemetery had become his entire world, a world of shifting shadows and elusive truths, where the only certainty was the ever-present sense of dread that hung over him, like a shroud. One night, as the fog rolled in, thick and heavy, he found himself drawn to a particular grave, a grave he had never noticed before, though it seemed to have been there for centuries. The headstone was old and weathered, its inscription barely legible, but he could just make out the words, Here lies the keeper of the truth, bound by darkness, cursed for eternity. His heart raced as he read the words, a chill running down his spine. Was this the key to the mystery? Was this the grave of the force that haunted the cemetery? The source of the whispers that had driven him to the brink of madness? He fell to his knees before the grave, his hands trembling as he began to dig, desperate to uncover whatever lay beneath. The earth was cold and damp, clinging to his fingers as he clawed at the ground, the fog swirling around him like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging him on, filling his mind with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. He dug faster, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the cold seeping into his bones as the hole grew deeper. And then, his fingers brushed against something hard. Wood, old and rotten, buried deep beneath the earth. He dug around it, his heart pounding in his chest until he had uncovered a small, ancient chest, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. His hands shook as he reached for the chest, the whispers now a deafening roar in his ears, warning him, pleading with him to stop. But he couldn't stop. He was too close, too desperate to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. He pried open the chest, the wood splintering beneath his hands, and stared in horror at what lay inside. It was a book, an old, leather-bound tome, its pages yellowed with age, its cover adorned with the same twisted symbols that covered the chest. But the book was not just old. It was alive. The leather seemed to pulse beneath his fingers, as if it had a heartbeat, and the symbols on the cover writhed and twisted, as if trying to escape their confines. The whispers had fallen silent, the cemetery holding its breath as he stared at the book, a sense of dread washing over him. With trembling hands, he opened the book, the pages crackling with a dark energy that made his skin crawl. The text was written in a language he couldn't understand, a language that seemed to be older than time itself, its words filled with a malevolent power that made his eyes burn. But as he flipped through the pages, the text began to shift, the letters rearranging themselves into a language he could comprehend. The book told a story of a great evil, a force that had been bound to the cemetery centuries ago, cursed to remain there for all eternity. The force had been powerful, its darkness seeping into the very earth, corrupting the cemetery, trapping the souls of the dead within its grasp. The book spoke of a ritual, a dark incantation that could awaken the force, breaking the curse and unleashing it upon the world. The gravedigger felt a cold terror settle in his chest as he realized what he had done. By uncovering the chest, by opening the book, he had begun the ritual, had set in motion a chain of events that could not be stopped. The force was awakening, its power growing with each passing moment, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The ground beneath him began to tremble, the cemetery itself seeming to come alive as the force stirred. The fog thickened, the air growing heavy with the scent of decay, and the whispers returned, more frantic than ever, begging him to close the book, to bury the chest, to run as far away as he could. But it was too late. The ritual was complete, the force had been awakened, and the cemetery was no longer just a place of the dead. It was a gateway to something far more terrible. He stumbled back from the grave, the book falling from his hands as the ground split open, the earth cracking and crumbling as the force began to rise. The air was filled with a deafening roar, the sound of 1,000 souls screaming in agony as they were torn from their graves, their spirits dragged down into the darkness. The cemetery was consumed by the force, the gravestones toppling, the trees withering and dying, the earth itself becoming a twisted, corrupted wasteland. And in the center of it all, the gravedigger stood, paralyzed by fear and despair, as the force took shape before him. It was a thing of nightmares, a swirling mass of darkness and malevolence, its form constantly shifting, never fully solid, but filled with an unimaginable power. The whispers had become a single terrible voice, speaking directly into his mind, telling him of the horrors that awaited him, of the darkness that would consume him, body and soul. He tried to run, to escape the force, but his legs refused to move, his body frozen in place by the sheer weight of the terror that gripped him. The force reached out, tendrils of darkness snaking toward him, wrapping around his body, pulling him closer. The ground opened beneath him, a gaping maw of darkness that swallowed him whole, dragging him down into the depths of the earth, where the force awaited him. As the darkness closed in around him, the last thing he saw was the cemetery, now a twisted, nightmarish landscape. Its gravestones shattered, its trees dead and rotting. The sky above filled with swirling clouds of black smoke. The whispers had fallen silent, replaced by the sound of his own heartbeat, loud and frantic in his ears. And then there was nothing. Nothing but darkness, cold and unending, as the force consumed him, pulling him down into the abyss, where he would be trapped for all eternity, just like the souls that had come before him. The cemetery returned to its previous stillness, the force now hidden once more, buried deep beneath the earth, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon its dark secret. The gravedigger was gone, his soul lost to the darkness, his body buried in a grave that would never be found. His story just another whisper in the wind, a cautionary tale for those who dared to venture into the cemetery of the forgotten. And so, the enigma remained unsolved, the mystery of the cemetery locked away, a puzzle that would continue to drive those who encountered it to the brink of madness until the end of time. The night of the final confrontation came without warning, as if the cemetery itself had decided that the time had come to reveal its darkest secret. The gravedigger had been teetering on the edge of madness for what felt like an eternity, his mind frayed by the endless whispers and the relentless torment of the shifting gravestones. The cemetery had become a prison, a place where time lost all meaning, and the boundaries between life and death blurred into a haze of terror and confusion. He no longer remembered what it felt like to be free, to be at peace. All he knew was the cold grip of fear that had wrapped itself around his heart, squeezing tighter with each passing day. The air that night was thick and oppressive, the sky above choked with dark, swirling clouds that blocked out the moon and stars. The cemetery was bathed in a strange, eerie glow, as if the very ground beneath it was radiating some unholy light. The fog had rolled in, denser than ever before, reducing visibility to mere inches, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of earth shifting, as if the graves themselves were stirring in anticipation. The gravedigger knew, deep in his bones, that something terrible was about to happen, that the cemetery's long-held secret was finally about to be revealed. He had spent the entire day in a state of mounting dread, the whispers growing louder and more insistent, their voices now a cacophony of fear and desperation. They no longer spoke in riddles or cryptic warnings. Instead, they screamed at him, begging him to leave, to run as far as he could before it was too late. But he couldn't leave. He was bound to the cemetery, tied to its dark fate by forces he couldn't begin to understand. And so, as the sun set and the darkness closed in, he found himself drawn to the heart of the graveyard, to the place where it had all begun, the old nameless grave that seemed to hold the key to the cemetery's terrible secret. He approached the grave with trepidation, the fog parting before him like a living thing, the whispers rising to a fever pitch in his mind. The ground beneath his feet felt unsteady, as if the earth itself was trembling with anticipation. The headstone, once weathered and faded, now seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, the inscription clear and legible. "Here lies the keeper of the truth, bound by darkness, cursed for eternity." The words sent a shiver down his spine, and he felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, as he realized that he was about to confront the very thing that had haunted him for so long. As he stood before the grave, the earth began to shift, the ground cracking and crumbling as something stirred beneath it. The fog thickened, wrapping around him like a shroud, and the whispers fell silent, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. The voice was unlike anything he had ever heard. Cold, malevolent, filled with an ancient power that made his blood run cold. It spoke his name, the sound of it reverberating through his bones, and he felt a terrible compulsion to obey, to do whatever the voice commanded, "Dig," the voice said, the single word filled with a dark, irresistible power. The gravedigger's hands moved of their own accord, reaching for the shovel he had brought with him, the cold metal biting into his palms as he began to dig. The earth was loose and damp, almost eager to be disturbed, and he dug with a frantic energy, driven by a force he couldn't control. The ground opened up before him, the hole growing deeper with each shovelful of dirt, until he had uncovered the rotting wood of a coffin. Its surface cracked and splintered, covered in the same twisted symbols that had adorned the book he had found in the mausoleum. The whispers returned, but they were different now, no longer pleading or warning, but filled with fear, as if the spirits themselves were terrified of what was about to happen. The coffin seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the wood creaking and groaning as if it were alive. And the gravedigger hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest, but the voice commanded him again, and he found himself unable to resist. "Open it," the voice said, and he had no choice but to obey. With trembling hands, he pried open the coffin, the wood splintering beneath his fingers, and stared in horror at what lay inside. The body was old, its flesh rotted away to reveal bones that glowed with a sickly, unnatural light. But it wasn't the skeleton that filled him with dread. It was the thing lying beside it, a book identical to the one he had found before, its cover adorned with the same writhing symbols, its pages crackling with a dark energy that made his skin crawl. The book seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the symbols twisting and shifting as if trying to escape the confines of the leather. The voice spoke again, filling his mind with its terrible power. "Read," it commanded, and though every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop, to close the coffin and run, he found himself reaching for the book, his hands trembling as he opened it. The pages were covered in the same ancient language, the words filled with a dark, malevolent power that seemed to reach out and grip his very soul. As he began to read, the ground beneath him shook, the earth splitting open as a terrible force began to rise from the depths of the cemetery. The fog thickened, swirling around him in a vortex of cold, clammy air, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the spirits of the dead were trying to drown out the words he was reading. But it was no use. The ritual had begun, and there was no turning back. The cemetery itself seemed to tremble with the force of the dark power that was being unleashed. The gravestones toppling, the trees withering and dying, as the ground split open to reveal a gaping chasm of darkness. From the depths of the chasm, a figure began to rise, a twisted, grotesque form, its body a mass of writhing shadows, its eyes burning with a cold, unholy light. The gravedigger stared in horror as the figure took shape, its form constantly shifting, never fully solid, but filled with an unimaginable power. The whispers fell silent, replaced by the sound of the figure's voice, deep and resonant, filled with a malevolence that made his blood run cold. "You have awakened me," the figure said, its voice echoing through the cemetery, filled with a terrible power. "You have broken the seal, and now I am free." The gravedigger tried to speak, to plead for his life, but his voice was lost in the roar of the dark power that surrounded him. The figure reached out with a hand made of shadows, its fingers like claws, and the gravedigger felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as he realized that there was no escape. The figure's hand closed around him, and he felt the life being drained from his body, his soul being pulled into the darkness that surrounded him. The cemetery trembled with the force of the dark power that had been unleashed, the ground splitting open as the figure began to rise, its form growing larger, more solid, as it drew strength from the gravedigger's life force. The air was filled with the sound of 1,000 souls screaming in agony, their spirits torn from their graves and consumed by the darkness. The gravedigger's vision blurred, the world around him fading into a haze of shadows and pain, as the figure's grip tightened, pulling him deeper into the abyss. And then, just as he felt his life slipping away, The figure spoke again, its voice filled with a terrible finality. "You are mine," it said, and the gravedigger knew that it was true. He had become a part of the darkness, bound to the cemetery for all eternity, his soul lost to the malevolent force that had been unleashed. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the figure's eyes, burning with a cold, unholy light as the cemetery collapsed in on itself, the ground splitting open to swallow the gravedigger whole. The cemetery returned to its previous stillness, the fog dissipating, the gravestones standing silent and unmoving once more. The figure was gone, its dark power buried deep beneath the earth, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon its dark secret. The gravedigger was no more, his body buried in the earth, his soul trapped in the darkness, bound to the cemetery for all eternity. The whispers returned, their voices filled with sorrow and despair, as they mourned the loss of yet another soul to the darkness that lurked beneath the cemetery. And so, the enigma remained unsolved, the mystery of the cemetery locked away, a puzzle that would continue to drive those who encountered it to the brink of madness until the end of time. The gravedigger's story became just another whisper in the wind, a cautionary tale for those who dared to venture into the cemetery of the forgotten. But the darkness remained, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the next victim, the next soul to be claimed by the malevolent force that had been unleashed. The cemetery was alive, its dark heart beating with a cold, unholy power, and it would never rest, never be at peace, until it had claimed all who dared to enter its domain. The night had passed, but the gravedigger was no longer the man he once was. What remained of him was a hollow shell, a vessel that had been emptied of all hope, joy, and sanity. The force he had unwittingly unleashed had not only taken hold of the cemetery, but had consumed him entirely. The days blurred into one another, each filled with a creeping sense of dread that weighed heavily on his soul. He was not alone in his torment. The voices of the dead surrounded him constantly, their whispers now a cacophony of despair that echoed endlessly in his mind. The cemetery had become a living nightmare, a place where the boundary between life and death no longer existed, and where every shadow seemed to hide something unspeakably evil. His shack, once a refuge from the elements, had become a prison, its walls closing in on him as the darkness seeped into every corner. The once familiar objects within it, the tools of his trade, the photographs of long-dead loved ones, had become alien and foreboding, their shapes distorted by the dim, flickering light of the lantern he kept burning at all hours. Sleep was a distant memory. When he closed his eyes, he was haunted by visions of the terrible force that now ruled the cemetery, its form ever-changing, always lurking just beyond the edge of his perception. Even the simple act of breathing felt like an unbearable task, each inhale filling his lungs with the scent of rot and decay, each exhale a desperate attempt to expel the tainted air that now filled the cemetery. The force had changed him, marked him in ways that went beyond the physical. He could feel its presence within him, a cold, dark core that pulsed with a malevolent energy. It whispered to him in the dead of night, filling his mind with dark thoughts and terrible urges. The line between his own thoughts and those of the force had become indistinguishable, and he found himself doing things he would have once considered unthinkable. He would wake in the middle of the night, covered in dirt, his hands raw and bloody from digging, only to realize he had been unearthing graves, as if compelled by some dark instinct that he could neither control nor understand. Each night, the terror grew stronger, more palpable. The gravedigger found himself wandering the cemetery in a trance-like state, drawn to the darkest corners of the graveyard by a force he couldn't resist. The gravestones seemed to shift and move of their own accord, forming patterns that he couldn't decipher, as if the cemetery itself was trying to communicate with him, to reveal some terrible truth that lay just beyond his understanding. The trees, once towering and majestic, had withered and died, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, clawing at the sky. The ground was soft and spongy beneath his feet, as if the earth itself was rotting away, its decay spreading like a disease that infected everything it touched. It was on one of these nights, as the moon hung low and bloated in the sky, that the final, horrific revelation came to him. He had been drawn to a remote part of the cemetery, a place he had never ventured to before, where the air was thick with the stench of death and the ground was covered in a thick black sludge that oozed from the earth like a festering wound. In the center of this forsaken place stood an ancient tree, its bark twisted and blackened, its roots digging deep into the corrupted soil. The tree seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its branches trembling as if in anticipation. The gravedigger approached the tree, his heart pounding in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to flee this place and never return. But the force that controlled him was stronger than his fear, and he found himself reaching out, his fingers brushing against the rough, splintered bark. The moment his skin made contact, a surge of dark energy shot through him, nearly knocking him to the ground. Images flooded his mind, visions of the cemetery as it had once been, a place of peace and rest before the darkness had taken hold. He saw the force, an ancient evil that had been buried deep beneath the earth for centuries, its power growing, festering, until it could no longer be contained. He saw the moment of his own undoing, the night he had uncovered the book, the night he had read the incantation that had unleashed the force upon the world. He saw himself, a man desperate for answers, for understanding, driven to madness by the very thing he sought to control. And he saw the force, awakening from its long slumber, spreading its darkness through the cemetery, corrupting everything it touched. He saw the spirits of the dead, trapped by the force, their souls twisted and deformed, their eternal rest shattered by the evil that now ruled the graveyard. And then he saw the final, terrible truth. The force had not been contained to the cemetery. Its reach extended far beyond the graveyard's borders, seeping into the town, the homes, the lives of those who had once been his neighbors, his friends. The town was already lost, consumed by the darkness that had started with him. He could see the people, their faces contorted with fear and despair, their eyes hollow and empty, as the force drained the life from them, turning them into soulless husks, just like the spirits trapped within the cemetery. The force had won. The cemetery was no longer just a place of the dead. It was a gateway to something far worse, a portal through which the darkness would spread, consuming everything in its path. And he, the gravedigger, was its herald, the one who had unleashed it upon the world, the one who had brought about the end. He fell to his knees, his hands clutching the dirt, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his actions crushed him. The force spoke to him then, its voice a cold whisper that filled his mind with a terrible clarity. "You are mine," it said, and he knew that it was true. There was no escape, no redemption, no hope. The force had claimed him, body and soul, and there was nothing left but the darkness that awaited him. As the gravedigger knelt before the ancient tree, the ground beneath him began to tremble, the earth cracking open as the darkness rose to claim him. The whispers of the dead filled the air, their voices a chorus of sorrow and despair as they watched him, their hollow eyes filled with a terrible pity. The roots of the tree snaked out from the ground, wrapping around his legs, his arms, pulling him down into the earth, into the abyss that awaited him. He struggled, but it was futile. The darkness was too strong, its grip unbreakable. The tree's roots tightened around him, pulling him deeper into the ground, the earth closing over him like a coffin. The last thing he saw was the sky, now blackened and devoid of stars. The moon a distant memory as the darkness consumed him, dragging him down into the void. The cemetery returned to its silence, the ancient tree standing tall and unyielding, its roots buried deep in the corrupted soil. The force had claimed another victim, another soul lost to the darkness that ruled the graveyard. The whispers of the dead faded, their voices now a distant echo, as the cemetery settled into its eternal rest, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon its dark secret. And so, The enigma of the cemetery remained, a puzzle that would never be solved, a mystery that would continue to haunt those who dared to venture into its depths. The force lay dormant, its power growing with each passing day, waiting for the next fool to uncover its dark truth. The gravedigger was gone, his soul lost to the abyss, his story just another whisper in the wind, a cautionary tale for those who might come after him. But the darkness remained, hidden beneath the surface, its tendrils reaching out, spreading through the earth, through the town, through the very fabric of reality itself. The force was awake, and it would never rest, never be satisfied, until it had consumed everything in its path. The cemetery was just the beginning. The end was coming, and there was no escaping the abyss of terror that awaited them all. The cemetery was quiet, unnervingly so, as if the very air had grown heavy with the weight of all that had transpired. The fog that had once clung to the ground like a living thing had dissipated, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt more oppressive than the mist ever had. The gravedigger's shack stood empty, the door hanging ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the remnants of his life, tools, papers, a dusty old chair, lay untouched, abandoned as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The lantern that had been his constant companion now sat cold and dark on the floor, its light extinguished for the final time. But the gravedigger had not simply disappeared. The cemetery, with all its secrets and horrors, had claimed him. The ancient tree in the farthest corner of the graveyard stood tall and unmoving, its gnarled roots digging deep into the earth, concealing what lay beneath. The ground around it was disturbed, the soil uneven, as if something had been dragged into the earth and buried hastily. The force that had awakened, that had consumed him, was now silent, hidden once more beneath layers of dirt and stone, waiting for its next opportunity to rise. Days turned into weeks, and the townspeople began to notice the gravedigger's absence. At first, it was just a vague sense of unease. He was a fixture of the town, after all, and his sudden disappearance left a void that was hard to ignore. They spoke of him in hushed tones, as if by saying his name too loudly they might summon whatever had taken him. But as the days passed and he failed to return, their concern grew. A few brave souls ventured into the cemetery to search for him, but they found nothing. No trace of the man who had spent his life tending to the dead. No sign of a struggle. No clues as to where he might have gone. It was as if he had been swallowed up by the earth itself. The cemetery, for all its silence, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. The gravestones, once shifting and moving of their own accord, were now still, their inscriptions clear and legible, though the names they bore meant nothing to those who saw them. The trees, once twisted and gnarled, stood tall and lifeless, their branches reaching up to the sky in a parody of life. The atmosphere was thick with the sense of something unfinished, a mystery that hung in the air like a shroud. The whispers, however, had not ceased. Those who dared to enter the cemetery after dark claimed to hear them, faint, disembodied voices that seemed to come from all around, speaking in tones that were both pleading and accusatory. Some said they heard the gravedigger's voice among them, though distorted and distant, as if he was calling out from the other side of a vast, impenetrable barrier. Others claimed the voices spoke of a great evil, of a darkness that lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. But these whispers were always dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations, the cemetery's sinister reputation playing tricks on the mind. Yet, despite these dismissals, the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing night. The townspeople began to avoid the cemetery altogether, even in daylight, and stories of hauntings and ghostly apparitions began to circulate. Some claimed to have seen the gravedigger, or at least something resembling him, wandering among the graves, his form translucent and flickering like a candle in the wind. These sightings were always brief, the figure disappearing the moment anyone tried to approach, leaving behind only a sense of dread and a chill in the air. As the days wore on, The mystery of the gravedigger's fate became a topic of morbid fascination. The more superstitious among the townspeople whispered that he had been taken by the cemetery, that he had uncovered some dark secret that had cost him his life. Or worse, his soul. Others speculated that he had simply gone mad and wandered off into the wilderness, never to be seen again. But no one could explain the strange occurrences that continued to plague the cemetery, the whispers, the shifting shadows, the uneasy feeling that something terrible was just waiting to happen. The final piece of the puzzle came one stormy night, when a group of curious teenagers decided to venture into the cemetery on a dare. They were the first to visit in weeks, the townspeople having grown too fearful to even step foot inside its gates. The wind howled through the trees as they made their way through the overgrown paths, the rain lashing against their faces as they laughed nervously, their bravado masking their fear. They carried flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness, casting long, flickering shadows on the gravestones. It was one of the girls who first noticed the disturbance near the ancient tree. The ground, uneven and soft, as if something had been buried there recently. The group gathered around, their flashlights illuminating the disturbed earth, their laughter fading as a sense of dread settled over them. The whispers began then, faint at first, but growing louder as they stood there, rooted to the spot. They could hear voices, pleading, accusing, crying out in despair, and then one voice rose above the rest, clear and unmistakable. It was the gravedigger's voice, distorted and filled with a sorrow so profound it chilled them to the bone. "Help me," the voice said, and the ground beneath them trembled. In a panic, the teenagers fled the cemetery, their screams echoing through the night as they ran back to the safety of the town. They spoke of what they had heard, of the gravedigger's voice calling out from beneath the earth, of the whispers that had followed them as they ran. The town was thrown into a frenzy of fear and speculation, and the cemetery was declared off-limits, the gates locked and the key thrown away. But it was too late. The darkness had already spread. The mystery of the gravedigger's fate now a part of the town's collective consciousness, a story that would be told and retold, growing darker with each retelling.